Step out of the car now. Ma'am, hands where I can see them. The command hit Lauren Carter before she even registered the red and blue lights bleeding across her rear glass. The voice was sharp, practiced, and carried the cold authority of a man who expected obedience on the first breath. Moments earlier, she had been driving west on Interstate 20 with steady patience, the late afternoon sun glinting off the hood of her Lexus and the quiet voice of Casey Musgraves floating through the cabin as a gentle reminder that the day, though long, had finally begun to settle. She had finished sentencing a meth trafficker in Tyler and was heading toward Dallas to mail her son's fall tuition. The $9,800 sealed in a plain bank envelope on the passenger seat. She was calm. She was tired. And she was unaware that Senior Trooper Caleb Maddox had already chosen her, had already rehearsed the questions he would ask, and had already justified the seizure he intended to make when she slowed, signaled, and eased onto the shoulder. The heat rolled over the asphalt in a thick wave, bending the air and tightening her throat. She checked her speedometer again. 72 in a 75. No reason for a stop. No warning in her mind, only the sudden presence of a man who walked toward her window as if he owned the next 40 minutes of her life. Before going into this story, where are you watching from? If you want more true civil rights stories told with clarity and respect, subscribe to the channel and give me a like so these important voices continue to reach people who care. Lauren handed over her license, registration, and insurance card the moment Maddox asked for them. Her fingers steady, her voice controlled, her face composed the way a federal judge's face learns to be composed even when the world around her is loud. She did not explain she was a judge. She did not mention her docket, her reputation, or the years she spent prosecuting narcotics cases. She simply complied. Maddox leaned closer, his sunglasses reflecting her image back to her in a small, distorted shape, and said she had been following a Peterbilt too closely. She replied with quiet certainty. I was 3 seconds behind. I counted. He gave a bland smile, one that never reached his eyes, then moved in a slow circle around her car as if cataloging a list of imagined offenses. At the passenger side, he stopped, lifted his chin, and inhaled deeply with theatrical exaggeration. I smell raw marijuana, he announced. The words were flat, practiced, and unbothered by truth, Lauren answered, her tone firm. You do not, and I do not consent to any search. Her words did not matter in that part of Texas. The claimed odor of marijuana was an all-access pass to every pocket, every compartment, and every sealed envelope inside a driver's vehicle. She knew that. He knew she knew. But Maddox only shrugged, the kind of shrug that told her the next steps had already been written. The search dragged on under a punishing sky. The temperature hovered near triple digits, and the sun pressed down with enough force to make each breath feel deliberate. Maddox tore through her trunk, the center console, the glove compartment, the fabric pockets behind the seats, each move made with the casual confidence of a man who believed internal affairs would never trouble him and the courts would never question his report. After 41 minutes of silence broken only by the steady hum of passing semis, he found the envelope. He held it up with a slow satisfaction, as though revealing contraband pulled from a smuggler's jacket. $9,800, he said, weighing the envelope in his hand. That's a felony amount to be carrying without explanation. Lauren responded with calm precision. It is tuition. I have the receipt. Maddox did not ask to see it. He did not request clarification. He did not pretend the explanation mattered. Instead, he removed a pre-printed form from his cruiser and began filling it out with unhurried strokes, the sun glinting off the silver clip of his pen. It was Form CR-3A, a civil forfeiture notice that allowed a trooper to seize money without an arrest, without filing charges, and without the inconvenience of proving wrongdoing. It was a tool built for abuse, sharpened by experience, and perfected under the quiet oversight of men like him. When he completed the form, he turned the clipboard toward her, pointing to the bottom line where a signature normally went. He tapped it lightly. "Driver refused to sign," he said, already marking the box himself. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. He returned the clipboard to his car, walked back to her with a look that hovered between victory and indifference, and handed her a thin yellow copy. Lauren reached for the door handle, her hand trembling for the first time. She wanted to drive away, to breathe, to escape the eyes watching her without emotion. But Maddox leaned forward, placing himself close enough for the body camera to capture every word, and said in a low, pointed tone, "Drive safe, Your Honor." She froze. He had known her identity from the moment he ran her plates. The stop was never random. The seizure was never incidental. It was calculated, targeted, and executed with the expectation that she would stay quiet, because judges often do. She drove away with both hands gripping the wheel, the radio silent now, the air conditioning struggling to push back the suffocating heat pressing through every window. 12 miles later, she pulled into a Love's Travel stop, parked behind the building, stepped out, and bent forward as her stomach turned. She vomited until her throat burned, then sat on the curb with her head bowed and her breath uneven, trying to steady the shaking in her hands. She had sent men to prison. She had ruled on complex constitutional claims. She had faced angry defendants, furious attorneys, and the crushing grief of families broken by addiction and violence. But she had never felt as powerless as she did on that curb, alone with the knowledge that a man with a badge had taken her son's tuition and dared her to do something about it. When her hands finally stilled, she stood, wiped her face, and walked back to the car. She did not cry, she did not scream, she only whispered one quiet promise to herself: she would not let this die. Lauren Carter waited until the house was quiet before she opened her laptop and listened to the audio again. Every second of Trooper Maddox's voice cutting through the stillness with the same cold confidence that had followed her off the shoulder of Interstate 20. She saved the file, encrypted it, and sent it to the only person she trusted with a story like this. When Dana Morales Ortega answered, her voice carried the steady patience of someone who had spent years uncovering truths that powerful people wanted buried. She listened once, without interruption, and when the last second of static ended, she spoke in a tone that was firm, low, and unbearably honest. "I owe you dinner when this is over," she said. It was not a joke. It was a warning about the length of the road ahead. Lauren thanked her, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark with her hands pressed together, knowing the real battle had just begun. Dana worked quietly over the next 3 weeks, the way good investigative reporters do when they sense a wall that needs a crack before it can fall. She reviewed cases, searched public records, and traced familiar patterns in unfamiliar names. She found that Maddox had a reputation for high-dollar seizures, a reputation the department praised with awards and performance reviews, even as complaints from drivers of color piled up in numbers too consistent to ignore. She did not publish. Not yet. She needed more than data. She needed a witness who had lived inside the machine and survived long enough to regret it. That witness found her first. At 10:47 p.m., a burner number flashed across her Signal account with one short message. "Maddox just took $9,800 from the judge, you know. I have 6 years of internal logs. I'm not doing this for free." The words were clipped, exhausted, and edged with desperation. Dana stared at them for a long moment before typing her response. "Name the place." They met at an abandoned Baptist church outside Lindale, the kind of place where walls echo and silence hangs heavy over every confession. The man waiting for her leaned against the shattered frame of the front doors, his shoulders hunched beneath a worn jacket, his eyes tired but still scanning the tree line as if expecting headlights to appear without warning. He smelled faintly of bourbon and the kind of regret that never fully evaporates. "Ray Booker," he said when she approached. 31 years with the Department of Public Safety. I signed off on hundreds of these." He paused and looked away, his jaw tightening with a grief that did not belong to a single moment. "I can't look at my wife anymore. I can't explain why we bought a boat when my paycheck never changed." Dana did not interrupt. She let the truth form at its own pace. Ray reached into his coat and pulled out a small Ziploc bag containing a 128-gigabyte thumb drive, sealed and labeled with a date written in shaky ink. "Everything is on here," he said. "Stop logs, group messages, photos they never thought anyone would see. If you run this, you bury me. But if you do not, they keep burying other people." The words were heavy, and he delivered them with a finality that pressed into the silence between them. Dana accepted the drive with careful hands. She knew the weight of evidence that could alter the direction of a state institution, and she also understood the burden it placed on everyone who touched it. She asked Ray why he came forward now, after so many years. He stared past her at the cracked stained glass window and answered with the quiet sincerity of a man unraveling, because one of them finally said it out loud. "Drive safe, Your Honor." They knew who she was. They knew her title. They still took it. If they feel untouchable with a federal judge, imagine what they do to people who cannot speak for themselves. He swallowed hard, his voice thinning with exhaustion. "If I die in the dark with this, it stays dark. I cannot let that happen." That night, Dana drove back to Dallas with the thumb drive hidden beneath the floor mat of her car, one eye on the rearview mirror, the other on the road ahead. She thought about Lauren's trembling hands after the stop. She thought about Ray's voice when he said he could not look at his wife. She thought about how many families had been stripped of their savings on that same stretch of highway, their stories written into forms that no one ever questioned because the system depended on silence. She uploaded the contents of the drive before dawn, partitioned everything into encrypted folders, and began the long work of connecting numbers to patterns, patterns to names, and names to a culture that had operated undisturbed for far too long. As she traced one stop after another, she saw the same signature appear at the bottom of dozens of forms. C. Maddox. She saw the same language in hundreds of reports. Odor of marijuana detected. Driver appeared nervous. Currency consistent with narcotics trafficking. None of the cases tied to major drug seizures. None led to trafficking convictions. But nearly all involved minority drivers, many carrying savings for rent, tuition, funeral expenses, or business purchases, money that vanished into the same pipeline without meaningful oversight. Lauren did not ask for updates, and Dana did not burden her with early findings. They both knew information. Once spoken aloud, carried risk. It needed to be timed, shaped, protected, meanwhile. Ray Booker spiraled between fear and resolve. He sent Dana 3 more messages over the next 2 weeks. Short, anxious check-ins that revealed the depth of his uncertainty. At one point he wrote, "They will know it came from me," Dana replied with steady reassurance. "We protect our sources. You came forward for the right reason." His final message before the story broke was only 5 words. "Do not let them win." As the evidence grew, the truth sharpened into something undeniable. Troop 7C had built an economy out of fear, suspicion, and unchecked authority. Senior Trooper Caleb Maddox was not a lone actor. He was simply the most efficient. Lieutenant Hargrove oversaw the numbers. Sergeant Pena signed internal reviews that never reached Austin. Retired Judge Warren Stillwell had trained half the troop on how to write seizure reports that would sail through federal court without challenge. Dana realized she was not looking at misconduct. She was looking at a system designed to reward it. By the time she called Lauren again, her voice carried a different kind of certainty, one forged from hours of documents, confessions, and quiet calculations. "This is bigger than your stop," she said. "This is a machine." Lauren listened, each word settling like a stone in her chest. She knew her life would not return to its careful balance. She knew the next months would test her patience, her safety, and the boundaries of the office she held. But she also knew she had made the right choice the night she hit send, for the first time since the stop. She exhaled slowly, her voice steady when she answered. "Do what needs to be done." Dana nodded to herself in the dim light of her kitchen and opened a new file on her laptop. The story had begun. The first crack had formed. June 12th arrived without ceremony. But the morning edition of the Dallas Morning News landed like a strike of lightning across the state. The headline stretched above the fold with quiet severity. Interstate 20 cash machine. How a single, the Department of Public Safety troop funds itself on the backs of minority drivers. Dana Ortega's investigation filled the page with numbers sharp enough to cut through years of denial, each statistic detailing a pattern no longer defensible. Over 6,000 extended stops in 5 years, 71% involving drivers of color, only 10.2% resulting in criminal charges. The story did not use Lauren Carter's name at her request, but the facts surrounding her stop, time, location, amount seized, were described with surgical precision inside the Department of Public Safety headquarters. The article spread through the ranks like a spark searching for dry brush in less than 4 hours. The department issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and harmful to the men and women who keep Texas highways safe. The words were predictable, polished by lawyers, and designed to assure the public that nothing was wrong. But beneath the surface, panic stirred. The phones at Troop 7C rang without pause. Supervisors huddled behind closed doors, and somewhere on the second floor, Lieutenant Nathan Hargrove began shredding documents he believed no one would miss. Out in the field, Trooper Caleb Maddox sat in his cruiser with the paper spread across his steering wheel, his jaw locked in a cold, deliberate fury. He reread every paragraph and realized the leak could not have come from outside. Someone within the troop had turned. The thought tightened around his throat like a slow hand. Lauren learned of the article the moment she stepped into chambers. Her law clerk held the newspaper with both hands, his expression sober. She took it silently and read the story while standing, her breath measured, her heart steady but heavy. She felt neither triumph nor relief, only gravity. A system that had relied on darkness was now blinking in the light, and she knew what exposure demanded. She placed the newspaper on her desk and instructed her clerk not to discuss the story with anyone. Then she closed the door and sat alone for a long minute, allowing the weight of what had begun to settle over her shoulders. She thought of Marcus, of the tuition he never received, and of the quiet dignity she fought to maintain during the stop. She also understood the ripple coming toward her. She had prosecuted cases that touched law enforcement misconduct. She had ruled against officers, dismissed suits, upheld others. Her name carried authority, and authority made her a target. The first sign arrived that afternoon when her chambers line rang and fell silent the moment her assistant answered. By evening, they had counted 23 hang-ups. By nightfall, 40. The next morning, a plain white envelope appeared in her courthouse mailbox, addressed in block letters with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of Marcus walking out of his dorm at University of Texas, Austin, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his head turned toward a friend. Under the photograph, someone had written in small, Firm handwriting. Next tuition payment stays with us. Lauren stared at the words with a stillness that hid the rising alarm in her chest. She folded the photograph once, placed it inside a drawer, and locked it. She did not tell Marcus. She did not tell her colleagues. She only told the one person who needed to know: Dana. When Dana arrived at her home that evening, she looked at the photograph for a long moment and then spoke softly, as though choosing each word with care. This means the story touched the right nerve. It also means we have to move fast. While Lauren faced the quiet siege around her, Dana confronted a storm of her own. The paper's editorial board received angry calls from political donors. The Texas Police Benevolent Association released a statement describing Judge Carter as an activist in robes who seeks to undermine law enforcement. Anonymous emails arrived accusing Dana of fabricating sources and twisting data. One message warned her that careers end when lines are crossed. Her editor offered security, but Dana refused. She had been threatened before. She understood what fear tried to accomplish. Instead, she worked longer hours, expanded her source list, and began tracing financial records that revealed overtime bonuses tied suspiciously to seizure spikes along the Interstate 20 corridor. She followed trails into county forfeiture accounts, private training programs, and weekend hunting trips funded by cash that never reached evidence rooms. With every document she uncovered, the picture sharpened. This was not a handful of rogue officers. This was a culture, established, protected, and rewarded. Meanwhile, Ray Booker watched the fallout with growing terror. His phone vibrated with messages from former colleagues, some couched as curiosity, others as veiled warnings. One read, "Whoever talked is dead when this settles." Another asked, "When did you stop being one of us?" Ray sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the carpet, feeling the familiar pull toward the bottle he kept hidden in the top drawer. He wanted relief, even temporary. But he also remembered the weight of the thumb drive in Dana's hands and the promise she made to protect him. He forced the drawer shut, his breath shaking, and whispered to himself, "I did the right thing." The phrase repeated like a prayer he hoped would steady him. But fear lingered. He checked the locks on his windows twice before sleeping. Inside the Department of Public Safety headquarters, the scramble accelerated. Hargrove held a late-night meeting with his command staff and spoke in clipped tones about media attacks and political enemies. He blamed activists. He blamed the courts. He blamed anyone except the men in his troop who had treated the highway like a river of unclaimed money. Officers left the meeting with the same unspoken order: find the leak. Maddox believed he already knew. He had seen Ray's growing distance over the years, the hesitation in his eyes, the discomfort during high-dollar stops. He remembered the day Ray refused to sign a questionable report and how that small act marked him as weak in a culture that worshipped results. Maddox did not need proof. He only needed opportunity. Lauren's pressure grew on a different front. The Texas Commission on Judicial Conduct opened an inquiry into whether her involvement with a politically charged media investigation constituted conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The language was sterile but sharp. It placed her under a cloud without accusing her directly. Her counsel warned her the process could drag for months, cost more than her annual salary, and potentially tarnish her reputation even if she was cleared. She listened quietly, nodded once, and signed the authorization for representation. She refused to let the inquiry intimidate her into silence. But the strain showed in private moments, late nights where she sat at her kitchen table with her hands clasped. The fear for Marcus pressed against her ribs like a slow, tightening band. As the week ended, the magnitude of the leak became impossible to contain. The Department of Public Safety patrol units along Interstate 20 reported drivers refusing consent to searches at unprecedented rates. Defense attorneys filed motions demanding body camera footage from Troop 7C stops. County judges recused themselves from forfeiture hearings that once passed without question, for the first time in years. The machinery of civil forfeiture along that stretch of highway stalled, and in the quiet that followed, something long overdue began to take shape. Accountability. The leak had pierced the silence. The walls were starting to tremble, and every person involved, Lauren, Dana, Ray, and the officers who feared exposure, knew the next crack would be louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. August arrived with heat that seemed to settle into the bones of East Texas. The kind of heavy warmth that turned every mile of Interstate 20 into a shimmering strip of tension. But the real pressure came from the quiet war building beneath the asphalt. The article had shaken Troop 7C, and the men who ran the machine understood that exposure demanded retaliation. It began with something that looked like an accident. Marcus Carter was driving west toward Austin after visiting his mother for a late lunch, his shoulder still tender from the stress of the last months, when two unmarked pickups appeared behind him near mile marker 203. They closed in with calculated precision when Marcus merged right to let them pass. The first truck darted in front of him while the second moved beside him, pinning him in at 70 miles an hour. A gentle tap can kill. The truck in front braked sharply. Marcus swerved, tires screeching, and the Lexus spun violently into the median. When the car stopped, the windshield was cracked, the airbag had deployed, and Marcus sat trembling with a fractured collarbone and a ringing in his ears that drowned out every sound but his own shallow breath. The two trucks slowed just long enough for him to see their silhouettes. Broad shoulders, ball caps, no plates, before they disappeared. By the time state troopers arrived, the drivers were gone. The report described it as a possible road rage incident. Lauren read those words at the hospital and felt something inside her shift from fear to resolve. But she did not speak her suspicion aloud. She held her son's hand, watched his eyes cloud with confusion and pain, and whispered, "You are safe now." The tremor in her voice was small, but it carried everything. While Marcus lay recovering, Ray Booker paid his own price. He left the Tyler Walmart with a small bag of groceries one quiet evening, unaware that two men were watching from the shadows of the adjacent lot. They followed him to his car. One grabbed him from behind, the other struck him across the face, and before Ray could raise a hand to defend himself, a blow to his ribs sent him to the ground. They did not steal his wallet. They did not take his keys. They only beat him until he stopped moving, then whispered something he could not understand through the ringing in his ears. When a shopper found him minutes later, Ray was unconscious, bleeding, and barely breathing, at the hospital. He drifted in and out of awareness, repeating the same broken sentence to the nurses. "I did the right thing. I did the right thing." No arrests were made. There were no cameras in the corner of the lot where the attack happened. The assault was classified as unknown assailants. Dana stood by his bed and watched Ray's fingers twitch with fear, and she felt a cold certainty settle over her ribs. She knew this was a message. She also knew they were running out of time. Inside Troop 7C, the retaliation moved in quieter channels. Sergeant Investigator Alicia Pena, 7 months pregnant, was called into Lieutenant Hargrove's office without explanation. She walked in with careful steps, her hand resting on her abdomen, her breath steady but tight. Hargrove closed the door behind her and gestured toward a seat. "We have a problem," he said, his voice controlled. "A leak." Alicia said nothing. She kept her eyes forward, aware that any wrong expression could betray her fear. Hargrove leaned back, folding his arms. Booker kept logs with names, logs that now belonged to a reporter. If your name is on his list, your family loses health insurance tomorrow. The words were delivered without emotion, as though he were reading policy instead of issuing a threat. Alicia sat frozen, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had stayed quiet for years because her job provided stability, because her husband's work was seasonal, because the twins she carried would need care she could not afford to lose. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the trap tightening around her, when she left the office. She paused in the hallway to steady her breath. She felt the weight of duty pressing against the instinct to protect her children. She understood that silence had consequences, and so did truth. She walked to her car with slow steps, aware that her life was beginning to tilt in a direction she could not yet name. Lauren faced a different kind of attack, one crafted with paperwork instead of fists. The Texas Commission on Judicial Conduct announced that it would review her apparent involvement in a media investigation that criticized a state law enforcement agency. The language was carefully measured, but the implication was clear. She was being accused of conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice, a phrase broad enough to swallow reputations whole. Her legal bills climbed past $90,000 within weeks. She received letters from attorneys advising caution, colleagues reminding her, gently, awkwardly, that judges were expected to avoid controversy. But controversy had already found her. She carried herself with dignity. But behind closed doors, she felt the walls closing in. She did not regret coming forward. She only regretted the cost being paid by the people she loved. As the month unfolded, the atmosphere around the Eastern District Courthouse shifted. Deputies walked her to her car with deliberate vigilance. Her clerk monitored calls before transferring them. Even the attorneys who appeared before her spoke with careful cadence, as if acknowledging the invisible pressure surrounding her seat. She continued her docket with calm professionalism, but her heart stayed divided between the courtroom and the memory of Marcus's broken voice saying, "I did not see them. Mom, they came out of nowhere." Dana carried the burden in her own way. Every new document she uncovered added weight. Every source she protected tightened the knot in her stomach. She slept with her phone beside her pillow, the screen lighting up with updates from colleagues, questions from editors, and messages from Ray's wife asking whether Dana believed the attack had been random. She could not lie. "No," she wrote, "this was not random, but we will finish what we started." The words steadied her more than she expected. And beneath all of this, inside the Department of Public Safety headquarters, fear began to fracture loyalty. Officers who once trusted the security of the troop now whispered in parking lots and glanced over their shoulders before walking into briefings. Rumors spread that the FBI had asked questions, that subpoenas were coming, that someone had already talked. Trooper Maddox smiled through it, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the pressure. He had built a career on the rush of seizing money, the praise of supervisors, the belief that the highway belonged to him. Now, for the first time, he felt the ground shift under his boots. By the end of August, every person touched by the story, Lauren, Marcus, Dana, Ray, Alicia, felt the cost in their bodies and their lives. The truth had cracked open the surface. The retaliation had arrived. The pressure had become unmistakable, and though none of them knew it yet, the worst days were still ahead, because the federal government had begun to watch, and once Washington looked south toward Texas, nothing would remain hidden for long. October arrived with a quiet shift in the air, the kind of shift that precedes a storm people pretend not to see. For months, the Texas Department of Public Safety had insisted the accusations were fabricated, exaggerated, or politically motivated, but the weight of the numbers, the leaks, the bruises, and the threats finally reached a place Washington could no longer ignore. The Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice opened a formal pattern or practice investigation into Troop 7C, and with that single announcement, the balance of power along Interstate 20 changed in a way no one inside the Department of Public Safety had expected. At sunrise 2 days later, Black Suburbans rolled into the Tyler Regional Headquarters with quiet purpose. FBI agents stepped out with sealed warrants, walked through the glass doors without hesitation, and moved straight toward the server room. The first trooper to speak tried to object, but the lead agent held up the warrant with a calm finality that ended any conversation. Within minutes, the servers were disconnected, boxed, and carried out as evidence. And in those boxes, hidden inside encrypted storage that the Department of Public Safety believed was secure, was the digital heart of Troop 7C's operation: messages, photos, group threads, internal audits, training memos, and years of data that revealed what the investigation would soon confirm. This was not misconduct by a few men. This was a culture, nourished from within. When analysts opened the files in Washington, one folder stood out immediately. It had been titled with the kind of bold confidence only men certain of impunity would choose. The folder was named Top Gun Club. Inside were digital photographs of cash stacks arranged on metal desks, highway shoulders, and motel tables. Some were captioned, Friday bonuses, lunch break, easy day. There were jokes about drivers who cried, jokes about families who begged to keep their rent money, jokes about teaching lessons to people who talked back. The messages were not subtle. They were not ambiguous. They reflected a troop that had treated a stretch of Texas highway as a private revenue stream. And when federal investigators compared the timestamps to the stop logs and forfeiture reports, the pattern became undeniable. Troop 7C had seized more cash from drivers than any other the Department of Public Safety troop, yet produced almost no related criminal convictions. It was a machine that never needed evidence, only power. The Department of Justice notified the Eastern District of Texas that the investigation was active. And by policy, Judge Lauren Carter was immediately recused from every case involving the Department of Public Safety. Her docket, once filled with narcotics cases, civil claims, and suppression hearings, suddenly went dark. She received the order from the chief judge in a quiet envelope that carried no judgment but conveyed profound consequence, without saying so aloud. The order protected her from accusations of bias while acknowledging that she was no longer simply a target of a traffic stop. She was a witness in a growing federal case. When she held the letter in her hands, she felt both the burden and the relief. The work she loved was being taken from her temporarily, but her silence would no longer be mistaken for acceptance. The system she served was now watching the system that had wronged her. The impact traveled far beyond her courtroom. Lieutenant Hargrove's voice lost its usual force during briefings. Troopers whispered in hallways with the uneasy awareness that their conversations might be recorded. Supervisors who once praised high forfeiture numbers now spoke cautiously about compliance. Maddox tried to maintain his swagger, but he could not hide the way his eyes followed every agent who walked through the building. His world had narrowed to the fear that someone inside the troop had already named him, and the fear carried a quiet desperation that pushed him closer to making mistakes. The most devastating turn came for Sergeant Investigator Alicia Pena, after Hargrove's earlier threat about losing her family's health insurance. She lived in a state of constant tension, her breath shallow, her steps slow, her hand resting protectively over her abdomen. She tried to work, tried to maintain a careful neutrality, but the pressure settled over her like weight she could not lift. One afternoon, after a particularly tense meeting where Hargrove warned that someone in this building is talking to the feds, Alicia felt a sharp pain across her stomach. She gasped, reached for the edge of her desk, and collapsed to her knees. Her co-workers rushed to her side, and minutes later she was in an ambulance, lights flashing across the asphalt toward Tyler Memorial Hospital. Stress had triggered premature labor. Hours later, still pale, still trembling, still bleeding, she delivered twins who needed immediate neonatal care. and as doctors worked around her, Alicia made a decision she had tried to avoid. She agreed to sign a federal proffer agreement with her signature. She became the first active-duty the Department of Public Safety investigator to cooperate with the Department of Justice. Her statement was long, painful, and delivered through tears. She described forged training logs, manipulated stop reports, internal warnings ignored, and a culture of silence enforced by threats. Her words carried weight because they came from inside, with detail that only someone at the heart of the system could provide. While Alicia fought for her children's survival, Ray Booker recovered slowly from his assault. He watched the news about the federal intervention with a mixture of dread and resolve. He knew that speaking out had brought danger to his doorstep, but he also saw something he had not expected. The federal government was now standing between him and the men who once controlled his life. When Dana visited him in the hospital again, he managed a small, exhausted smile. "They cannot bury this now," he whispered. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice steady. "No, Ray, they cannot." As the Department of Justice deepened its investigation, the Department of Public Safety could no longer control the narrative. State lawmakers demanded answers. County judges began reopening old forfeiture cases. Defense attorneys filed motions for suppression in clusters, and families who had lost money years earlier began contacting the Dallas Morning News, asking whether their stories counted too. Dana worked from morning until midnight, sifting through new leads with the precision of someone who understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. Every piece of evidence, every interview, every timeline she reconstructed added clarity to a picture the state could no longer hide. Lauren watched all of this from a distance she did not choose but accepted. She attended therapy sessions, protected Marcus from the worst details, and tried to hold her life steady even as the world around her tilted into chaos. But she also carried a quiet certainty that justice, slow, uneven, painful, was beginning to move in her direction. By the end of October, the federal government had taken control of the investigation. Troop 7C was no longer an isolated scandal. It was a case study of abuse, a corridor of corruption, a system that needed dismantling. And though none of the main players could see it clearly yet, the reckoning that waited ahead would be unlike anything Texas, the Department of Public Safety, had faced in decades. Because for the first time, the power rested not in a patrol car on the side of a highway, but in a courtroom where the truth would finally be spoken aloud. July arrived with a heat that clung to the federal courthouse in Tyler, as if the sun itself wanted to witness what happened inside. On the morning of the first plea hearing, a quiet crowd gathered. Lawyers, federal agents, reporters, former drivers whose savings had vanished on the shoulder of Interstate 20, and citizens who simply wanted to see whether the system that failed them would finally speak with honesty. Inside courtroom 3, the air held the stillness of a room preparing for truth. Judge Lauren Carter was not on the bench. She had been recused months earlier. Instead, Judge Rebecca Goldstein presided with solemn patience, her robe falling in steady lines as she waited for the marshals to bring in the defendant. When Senior Trooper Caleb Maddox stepped through the door in his orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, the room tightened with a collective breath. The man who once walked the highway with swagger now moved with the reluctant shuffle of someone who had finally reached the edge of excuses. He sat beside his attorney, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the table as if refusing to meet the faces of the people he had harmed. When the judge asked how he wished to plead, the words came out with a thin crack in his voice. "Guilty. Your Honor, 2 counts, rights under color of law, theft from drivers he claimed had broken rules that never existed." The judge clarified each charge, each element, each consequence. Maddox responded with the slow resignation of a man who had spent months fighting inevitability. when the courtroom heard the recommended sentence, 51 months, with pension forfeited and supervised release to follow. There was no applause, no outburst, only a heavy silence that recognized what accountability sounded like when spoken aloud. Maddox bowed his head, and for the first time, the room saw a man confronting the truth he had built with his own hands in the days that followed. Lieutenant Nathan Ray Hargrove faced his own reckoning. The Marine veteran who once told his troop that the highway was a war zone now stood before a federal judge accused of conspiracy. Years of training logs falsified, supervisory approvals manipulated, and performance rewards tied directly to unlawful seizures. He arrived in court with stiff posture, his hair grayer, his expression hollow with exhaustion that came not from age, but from the collapse of a narrative he once believed. He pleaded guilty without argument. 38 months, pension gone, a career erased. His wife sat in the gallery, her hands folded tightly, her breath unsteady as she listened to the consequences of choices she never made but would now live with. When Hargrove turned to walk out of the courtroom, escorted by marshals, he moved with the slow acceptance of someone who understood that a lifetime of certainty had dissolved in a single hour. The ripple spread beyond the defendants. The Department of Justice released a statement announcing that the investigation had uncovered a pattern of systemic misconduct within Texas, the Department of Public Safety Troop 7C, leading to widespread constitutional violations. The wording was measured, but the impact was seismic. Within weeks, Texas, the Department of Public Safety entered negotiations that ended in the largest consent decree the state had ever signed. 15 years of federal oversight, mandatory off-site storage for every piece of body camera footage, a statewide ban on cash forfeiture without parallel criminal charges, a $14.7 million victim compensation fund built for the 1,589 verified claimants who had lost savings, rent money, tuition, funeral funds, and the small but precious reserves families keep for emergencies no one wants to imagine. The decree shattered the financial backbone that Troop 7C had relied on for years, forcing the Department of Public Safety to rebuild its practices from the ground up. Reporters filled Austin, Tyler, and Dallas with coverage that stretched across months. Editorials debated the meaning of accountability in law enforcement. Legal analysts traced the historical roots of civil forfeiture abuse. Families who once believed no one cared about their stories now stood outside courthouses giving interviews with tears of relief. Some spoke of gratitude, some spoke of trauma, all spoke of a system that had finally answered back. In the middle of this, retired Judge Warren T. Stillwell, the quiet architect who had taught generations of officers how to write seizure reports that courts rarely questioned, watched events unfold from his ranch outside Longview. Colleagues expected him to testify. Prosecutors expected to indict him, but 19 days before the grand jury vote, he suffered a massive heart attack. Emergency services arrived too late. His death closed a door on a chapter of the corruption that would never see trial. The news spread through legal circles with a mixture of shock, sorrow, and grim acknowledgement. He had built the language that protected the machine. He would never be forced to defend it under oath. As the consent decree took shape, the atmosphere around Texas, the Department of Public Safety, changed in ways impossible to ignore. Troopers now recorded every stop with the awareness that federal eyes might review them. Supervisors received mandatory training on constitutional compliance. Internal affairs gained authority it had not held in decades. And for the first time, the families affected by Troop 7C felt something close to justice. Not perfect justice, not equal to the fear, humiliation, or financial loss they endured, but justice that carried weight and consequence, spoken from a bench backed by the United States government. And through all of it, Lauren Elizabeth Carter remained quiet. She watched from a necessary distance, her name still protected, her dignity still intact. She received updates through official channels, not private conversations. She did not celebrate the sentences. She did not attend hearings. She respected the boundaries placed on her by ethics and by the role she carried. But when she read the final text of the consent decree, its pages filled with reforms that would save strangers from what she endured, she closed the document slowly and allowed the smallest breath of relief to leave her chest. The highway that once stole her confidence now rewrote its rules. The men who abused their authority now carried felony convictions. The system that dismissed countless voices now acknowledged them. And though the story was not yet over, though the aftermath still waited ahead, the reckoning had finally come. It came in courtrooms, in conference rooms, in evidence files, in plea agreements, and in the quiet acknowledgement that power only protects itself until someone demands the truth be spoken aloud. 18 months after the stop. The rhythm of Judge Lauren Elizabeth Carter's life no longer resembled the quiet order she once guarded so carefully. The federal cases had ended. The consent decree was signed. The guilty pleas entered. And the state of Texas had been forced to confront a scandal that exposed the deepest weaknesses in its highway enforcement culture. Yet victory had never felt like triumph. It felt like exhaustion, layered across months of fear, vigilance, and the slow unraveling of everything she once assumed was stable. When her doctor quietly recommended an extended leave of absence, she accepted without protest. She packed a single suitcase, left her home in Tyler in the care of a neighbor, and drove south to Houston to stay with her mother. For the first time in decades, she slept in the bedroom she had grown up in, the same room where she memorized case law as a young prosecutor and where she prayed for strength the night before her first federal confirmation hearing. Therapy became a weekly ritual, steady, structured, necessary. She spoke in measured sentences at first, offering facts instead of feelings, as judges often do. But over time, the walls she had built for survival began to loosen. She talked about the moment Maddox leaned toward her window. She talked about Marcus's fractured collarbone. She talked about the photograph in the envelope, the hang-up calls, the accusation from the Judicial Commission, and the steady hum of fear she carried through every hallway and courtroom. Healing arrived slowly, sometimes gently, sometimes with sharp clarity. As she faced memories she once tried to outrun, Marcus completed his sophomore and junior coursework online while his shoulder healed. Each semester a quiet testament to resilience he never sought. He no longer drove Interstate 20 without careful planning. He kept his phone fully charged. He sent his mother his location before long drives. At night, he sometimes replayed the crash in dreams, waking with a jolt and taking a slow breath until the panic passed. But he also grew into a young man who understood the cost of courage, because he had watched his mother shoulder a burden heavier than most citizens ever imagine. When graduation approached, he told her gently that he wanted to attend law school one day, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because someone in the system has to protect the truth. She nodded with proud, quiet understanding. Across the state, Dana Morales Ortega became a household name in journalism circles. Her investigative series, built on a year of documents, late-night interviews, encrypted messages, and relentless persistence, won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. On the day her award was announced, she stood on the steps of the Dallas Morning News building with her son beside her, speaking to cameras with a steady voice that carried no triumph. She thanked her editors. She thanked her sources. And then she said something that stayed with people long after the microphones were packed away. Stories like this do not destroy trust in law enforcement. They restore it by removing what was never worthy of trust in the first place. When she later visited Ray Booker to share the news, he wept quietly, not from pride, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing that the truth he carried for too long had finally been heard on a national stage. Ray recovered slowly, both physically and emotionally. His ribs healed, his bruises faded, But the guilt lingered. He had spent years approving reports he knew were wrong. He had signed forms that justified seizures he suspected were unlawful. Therapy helped. Sobriety steadied him. And eventually he founded a small nonprofit dedicated to supporting whistleblowers in law enforcement. People who found themselves trapped between conscience and survival. He called it The Bridge, explaining to Dana that some officers want to cross from silence to truth, but they do not know how to make it safely. The work gave him purpose. It also gave him peace. Meanwhile, Troop 7C, as the world once knew it, no longer existed. The Department of Public Safety disbanded the unit entirely, folding what remained into other regions under strict federal oversight. Body camera footage was now stored off-site in cloud systems monitored by external auditors. Every traffic stop was reviewed randomly by federal monitors. Training was rewritten from the ground up, and every trooper knew the old days were gone forever. Some resented the change, others quietly welcomed it. Most simply adjusted, aware that the highway no longer belonged to the men who once operated there with unchecked authority. Though Lauren kept her distance from the investigation, she could not escape the role she played in its beginning. Local activists wrote letters of gratitude. National outlets mentioned her case without naming her. Law students studied the consent decree as an example of structural reform, but she did not seek the spotlight. She spent afternoons sitting on the back porch of her mother's house, listening to the soft rustle of the Houston breeze, letting silence settle over her. She prayed sometimes, though not always aloud. She began cooking again. Simple meals, carefully prepared, one small ritual at a time, and slowly, gently. Life softened its edges. One Saturday afternoon, 20 months after the stop, she felt ready. She called her mother, told her she would be late for dinner, and drove north until the trees thinned and the familiar highway stretched ahead. The sun was bright, the road open, at mile marker 178. She felt her pulse tighten, but she kept driving. When she reached mile marker 178, the place where everything changed, she exhaled slowly, as if releasing a weight trapped beneath her ribcage. She continued west until blue lights flashed behind her. Her heart surged, just for a moment. With memory, she pulled over carefully, lowered her window, and folded her hands in her lap. A young white trooper approached. His voice was calm, respectful, almost apologetic. "Good afternoon. Ma'am, you were going a little over. May I see your license?" She handed it over without explaining who she was, without offering any title, without revealing anything that might influence the moment. He wrote a citation. He returned her license. And then he said what no one had said to her in almost 2 years. "No search today. Just slow it down." She stared at the ticket for a long moment, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. Then she met his eyes and spoke with a voice that carried pain, strength, and gratitude all at once. "Thank you, Trooper. Thank you for doing it right." He stepped back. She rolled the window down the rest of the way. She turned the music up, not to drown anything out, but to let something in. And as she merged back onto Interstate 20, driving west into the blinding sun, she felt the road settle beneath her in a way it had not settled since the day it tried to take something from her. She was not the same woman. The state was not the same place. And for the first time in a long time, the highway felt honest. Thank you for watching. If you value stories like this, subscribe to the channel and press like to support the work.